Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1220th New Social Environment. I'm Magley, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Hellen Ascoli and Chloe Stagaman. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Hellen Ascoli is a Guatemalan artist, weaver, and educator living in Baltimore, Maryland, and Guatemala City, Guatemala. She was a resident at ISCP in 2023, supported by the Pollock-Krasner Foundation. Her work has been the subject of solo exhibitions at the Contemporary Arts Center, Cincinnati, La Nueva Fábrica, Antigua Guatemala, Guatemala, Art Paiz, San Antonio, Texas, among others. She has participated in group exhibitions at institutions internationally, and her work was recently featured in Flow States, La Trienal 2024 at El Museo del Barrio, New York, and is currently on view in Sharjah Biennial 16. And our host today, Chloe Stagaman, is a Brooklyn-based arts worker, writer, and curator. She is the director of programs at the Brooklyn Rail, where she works on this program, The New Social Environment. And with that, I will hand it over to Chloe to get us started.
Thank you so much, Magli, for that introduction. And thank you most of all to Hellen Ascoli for being here today. How are you today, Helen?
Good. Thank you all for coming. It's nice
Thank
to
you.
see a couple of familiar faces in here too.
Helen, we're here to talk about your work on the occasion of your first retrospective in New York, The World Upside Down, curated by Melinda Lang at the International Studio and Curatorial Program in Brooklyn, and following your residency there in 2023. The show is curated across an X-shaped second floor gallery at ISCP and features 10 artworks, the earliest of which is from 2014, and the others of which are made mostly in the last year or so. And before we get into the show, I wanted to give you a moment to introduce your practice. You use many methodologies, among them weaving, writing, interpreting, listening, and storytelling to re-examine histories and complicate perceived fixities of language, of the body, of borders, and of space. Your work is replete with both ands, exploring language as it's both seen, heard, and misheard, the body as it relates to an architecture, to a tree, or the natural world, also to another body. And I'm thinking here of the many collaborations that you've done over the years with other artists and poets and writers, which we'll get into. And significantly, I'm thinking of the body of your longtime collaborator, the backstrap loom, which has become a critical co-conspirator and co-storyteller in your practice of layering time and thread in the studio. And so I want to start with three refrains in your practice. You often describe your work through the words proprioception, affordances, and translation. And so I wonder how you define these words and how they've unfurled as a part of your practice in the studio. And while you're answering, I'll pull up your images.
Thank you. Um, yeah, I think when we talked a little bit about Chloe as to how to frame my work, I like to just show some of these words, not necessarily as an artist statement or this fixed statement of my work, but rather just creating a map for you all to enter into some of my work. And so, even though my bodies of work may change, I kind of notice that at different points in time, I'm kind of moving along these words and kind of moving closer to translation or moving closer to the sensory system or object making. And so, yeah, I just wanted to create a map for us to share. The first point on this map is proprioception. And this is the sensory system that locates your body in space. So a way that you can think about it is if you're sitting right now in a chair, you can feel the proprioceptive system activated because you are feeling pressure on the bottom of your legs, the bottom of your feet, perhaps, the back of your chair. And it's really through that pressure sending signals to internal parts of the body, specifically the joints, that we can understand where we're located in space. And so the image that you're seeing right now is a still from the video that was also shown in The World Upside Down. And it's a piece where I rolled at the highest part of Guatemala, which is the Cuchumatanes. And I really wanted to create a larger area of proprioception through rolling and understand and relocate my body to Guatemala. Later on, I use the backstrap loom as a tool for proprioception, connecting my body to space. This is just a still of the video that I think we'll see a little bit later that is shown in The World Upside Down. So I think we can move to the next slide. The next point in this map is this term affordances that I took from an essay by J.J. Gibson, where he defines it as a set of relationships determined by the material and physical characteristics of things. So to create affordances is really to look at the relationship between object to object, object to space, object to body. And in my practice, I use affordances to read spaces and bodies and how they relate. It is a strategy for observation. It's how I create objects and start to engage with them and understand them as a language, and how it creates a space that we all coexist in, of course. But I also think of them as a way to read both the presences and absences of other bodies. So whether it's that we are being able to read or misread each other, I think is very determined by the way that I look at affordances. If you are unfamiliar with the backstrap loom, I like to show this image of me weaving in Guatemala. You can see my dog and my husband in there. And I am attached to an architecture. So in this case, my stairs. And the warp threads are held in tension between the architecture and mecapal, which is the strap that attaches to my body. And so I think a lot about another sense of tension created by the loom, and how tension is needed to understand the other. So if you move to the next slide, the reason I'm calling the backstrap loom another is because I see, or am in the line of seeing and understanding, the backstrap loom as another body. This is not something that I am inventing, let's say. This is something that has a long history, and you can see it within the Mayan language. In this case, or in this graph, I am comparing it to Cachiquel, which is one of the Mayan languages that I'm, let's say, closer to, because one of my collaborators, this is her main language, Negmagoy. And you can see here how in the words used to describe the tool body, if you translate it over into Spanish or English, you can see that the backstrap loom has a head, has feet, has a heart, has a stomach. And I'm really careful in thinking about how different languages like Spanish or English, in translating the tool, we will then actually take the body away from it. So pupush, which is heart, then becomes dividing stick. So those are two very different ways to look at the tool that you're working with. And it is really through having learned these words, and then after many years of working with the backstrap loom, that I realized, well, actually, this is a collaboration. This is something that I'm listening to, and I'm advancing only as fast as it is permitting me to advance. So I often don't take on techniques that I'm kind of, maybe I could be technically ready, or I can force them into my practice. but rather I kind of let them grow, or an external need kind of push, or that sense of proprioception kind of through pressure guide me into developing it or being in conversation with a new technique. Um, and then the last word, translation, which is the proprioception of words, is the way that I'm defining it. It articulates the relationship between language and objects. Um, and I use translation to understand how language is connected to power, and poetry as a tool for translation. I'll say that when I kind of devised these different points in my practice, I wasn't quite yet working as an interpreter. But translation's always been a part of my life. I have moved back and forth between the US many times. My family is all in Guatemala. My partner is from the US. I kind of serve as an informal translator. And then 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I moved to Baltimore. And then 2 years ago, I started to formally work as an interpreter here in Baltimore, mostly working with young Central American kids who are often in situations of either having been abused or being in detention centers. So yeah, I'll kind of, oh, wait, and then I wanted to put this slide in here. I like including it because you'll see this common motif of X's and E's throughout my work. And initially, when I mentioned this to people, it seems almost like a very technical thing to say. But they arise in the way that the backstrap loom is talking to me. So although I am marking them as alphabetical letters, I am not understanding them as such. I'm understanding them more as forms. And I'll point them out when relevant along the other images, but they often pop up in my work. E being kind of this homing presence as kind of an organization of thought and an integration, and X being kind of a way to understand change, and also later on situating X as a way to give name to bodies that have been disappeared or who are no longer with us. And so in Guatemala, when an X is marked, it is often referring to a person who has been disappeared, who's no longer with us. But then by definition, weavers become readers of these absences or X's as they appear and disappear within the loom. So yeah.
Thank you for that introduction, Helen. Often when you speak about your work with the backstrap loom, you give a disclaimer in your conversations where you talk about being from Guatemala, but not being Mayan yourself and working within a tradition of making weavings that has a long history in Mayan culture. And I wonder if you can talk about what the backstrap loom technique means to you as a tradition personally and as a manner of storytelling.
Yeah. I think as we are often as kids, I was introduced to the backstrap loom as kind of this activity that I did after school, right? I later did soccer and, flamenco dancing and all of these things, but I learned it quite young. And I think there was something very important about learning it. I learned it around age 8 or 9, which actually situates me quite alongside the time many girls learn to weave in Guatemala as well. So I had that experience, although I wasn't coming from a family that existed within this tradition. And then, as many kids do, I kind of abandoned it and went on to do many things. But I think there was something about it that stayed with me. And I studied sculpture. I went through kind of a long series of processes and trying to find my voice alongside materials. And it wasn't until I returned back to Guatemala after graduate school that I went back to the backstrap loom. I think it's called to me. And there was a certain point in time where it almost felt irresponsible to not go into it and learn more. And I think about it also in terms of language and thinking if the vast majority of people in my country are using this body tool to write and tell their stories, then it is, again, almost irresponsible of myself to not be able to read them. So, kind of following the schooling that I mentioned, when I was in high school, for us to graduate high school, we had to teach an illiterate person how to read and write. This was imposed by the government for us to do so. And it quite marked me, same as learning the backstrap loom, and affected my way of understanding how we were calling so many people with a vast knowledge in understanding the world and reading it, and calling them illiterate. This repeated itself when I worked at Museo Ixchel, which is the textile museum, and encountering many racist comments about people who wove. And so then it became my job to learn how to read and write in this language that surrounded me, and it has surrounded me since I was a kid. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I entered into it, out of a sense of responsibility to it and being able to read my surroundings.
Sorry, a minute to unmute there. Thank you, Helen, for that answer. I think when when you're in the gallery, there's this work alongside Encuentro, the work that you showed us still from, which features a corte. And I've heard you tell this story that I think is really fascinating, related to what you've just talked about, and how the corte and the skirt itself has is rooted in a practice of dressing the body and of thinking about the body in relationship to a history and a story of family. And I wonder if you can tell us that story from your time working in Guatemala, and sort of how it shaped your understanding of um, fabric as it relates to the body, and changed your understanding of Encuentro as a work, which you had made prior to being there.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for giving me space to kind of wander around. I do want to say I often find myself in these conversations. I'm sure Melinda, who so generously curated and gave me space for this show to kind of wander around the conversations, is that I tend to start in one point and then I'll wander and be like, oh, right, that word came up during high school and during, you know, when I was 8, and then again in graduate school and all of this. And I think that it's because I see my work as ever moving, which is why fixing a statement to it seems almost disingenuous. So thank you for letting me wander there. And as you do so, I'll bring it to this story, which so I was working at Museo Ixchel, which is the indigenous dress museum in Guatemala, and a really impactful story happened where a social worker came to the museum because a girl that he was working with was about to turn 18 and then kind of be let go out into the world and no longer be in the care of the state. This girl, he wasn't totally understanding if she had never learned Spanish and that's why she wasn't speaking, or if it's that something else had happened. She became part of the state, under the state care, when she was orphaned during a bus accident and lost both her parents. All of this to kind of frame that the social worker concerned about her came to the museum and presented us with some clothing of the time during when that accident had happened. And in there was a wraparound skirt, hoping that the curator would be able to identify what community she was from. And so the curator asked the social worker to please bring the girl in and see how she dressed. Um, that day, we kind of prepared with several cortes and see which corte she was drawn to and a mirror. And the curator kind of very quickly said to please take away the mirror, that this wasn't a way of dressing, or that it wasn't used during the act of dressing. And then when the girl came, she proceeded to take one of the cortes and wrap it around. And by wrapping it around in the left direction versus in the right direction, and then kind of giving it a snap in the way that she put it on, the curator, between that and the motifs that she had seen before, was able to determine the exact location, because it wasn't just a thing of reading the symbols in the textile, but also the act of getting dressed. And at this time, it like started to come together how proprioception is such an important part of textiles, that it goes beyond the symbolism that is embedded within them, but it is also about how they wrap around our body and kind of add that pressure and sense of location. And so, given all of this information, the social worker was able to determine the community she was from, and we kind of lost contact after that, but I assume then went on to see if there was any remaining family member there. I think that is then connecting to this image, which is titled Interpreting Anna, because as I started on my path as being an interpreter, I worked with a young 15-year-old girl from Guatemala who entered the US. And the encounter I had with her was quite a difficult one. She had moved here on her own and had crossed the border on her own, and kind of had suffered horrific abuse in this process. She was around 15 years old when I met her, and was not necessarily reading and writing alphabetical language, and was also in this like ambiguous period of starting to forget Quiche, which was her language, speaking Spanish in different states of fluidity, and starting to learn English. And contribute to that this sense of displacement and confusion and trauma that she had lived, and that I was shadowing her for about 12 hours a day. It created a really destabilizing sense of self and a relationship to me. And so I started bringing her this paper raffia to weave. So in the image in the back, you see a corte. In kind of the middle ground, you see a backstrap loom that has then been cut, so is no longer attached to a place. And then these raffia weavings, which are just paper, like knotting and almost like building a nest out. And it got embedded in this word, Anna, which is read back and forth. And you can see here how the X, I don't know if you're able to fully see, but by reading in both directions, you can see that it spells Anna. And then the middle figure obviously connects to make an X, same as top. And yeah, it was my way of bringing all of this together and thinking again about the first story that I told you in relationship to my new relationship with Anna.
One of the things I loved about looking at this work is the way that each of the materials serves a different purpose in creating an ecosystem almost within the work. It creates a process that's unfolding in front of you. The raffia has a completely different spirit than the backstrap loom weaving and the corte below it. And I wonder when you're layering, how you're thinking about storytelling, and also obviously Anna is a palindrome. I know that palindromes recur in your work, and I wonder if you can talk about what they open up for you in telling stories with collaborators and thinking about other ways of reading and ways of existing in relationship to stories and to self.
Yeah. Um, so I'll kind of start at the top with palindromes. It seems to be kind of a dorky obsession, but I I think initially when I would hear okay, text and textile are similar words. They relate and we bring them together so often and almost so like assumingly like, yeah, okay, they're the same thing, but then it's also our job to then ask how are they the same and how are they different? And so one of the investigations that I've kind of undergone is how is reading and writing in different forms similar and how do they differ? Because it does change our perception of the world, right? And so in reading and writing in most alphabetical languages, you're going um, either up to down or down to up, depending on the language, and left to right or right to left, but you're kind of always returning, right? But in weaving, you're going back and forth. And so it kind of became as a silly game of like, okay, what word can be written and going in both directions back and forth? And I had seen a work by Ana Maria Maiolino where she has this palindrome. So her name is Ana, um, in between two figureheads that are supposed to represent her mom and dad, and them speaking Anna back and forth. And so I thought, I don't know, this has something to do both with the act of writing and also the position that I'm taking with Anna as kind of this middle person of going back and forth. Um, I will say though that at one point during making this piece, I felt completely lost in it and I kind of abandoned it. It's gone through a couple different iterations. I think I had to clear up at one point, okay, how is this? What is it that I'm doing? And I kind of realized maybe this is a portrait of Anna. I say this almost as an insecure thing. I don't know. A lot of these works still feel very fluid. Um, and I guess I will, hopefully this makes sense, but one of the quotes that I picked for sharing with the the group um, is from an essay about rethinking the debate on textile designs as writing. And so the author, Denise Arnold, says that she is interested in thinking or interpreting text as textiles, not just as stylistic evidence or ethno-historical traits, but in focusing what textiles do and what they enable for their makers. Meaning that they're interested in what the act of writing and inscribing a substrate does. And that'll change if we're going from paper to thread to raffia. That substrate is catching different aspects of our communication. And so that's how the raffia became embedded. I was thinking about how to give Anna a way to transcribe in a material that she was able to access that was beyond this alphabetical paper writing.
I want to get into another work that's on view in the exhibition and is actually the first work that you see when you enter the show, which is Koyo Shalkui and is in reference to the moon goddess. Um, and it has these two sides that are sort of held together by this loose raffia thread that sometimes threads into the corners of the sides. And I have a detail here so that those in the audience can kind of see what I'm talking about. But it's really striking when you come into the space and looking at it, prompted a reinvestigation into Koyo Shalkui as a goddess and the story of her, who is the goddess of the moon and attempted to kill her brother, who was the god of the sun. And when he came out of the womb, he dismembered her. And there's this fragmentation that is forever associated with Coyolxauhqui. And Gloria E. Alzadua, when she writes about Coyolxauhqui in her writings, talks about the imperative of Coyolxauhqui and this idea of the fragmented self, sort of grappling with the fragmented self and the ongoing and lifelong process of healing from events that have fragmented the self and severely wounded the self. And you can really feel that imperative in the work and in the way it speaks to both your work and translation of two sides sort of meeting in the middle somewhere and finding a core and a heart in the truth that they know in unison together, but then also in the struggle constantly of weaving new cloth from what's already there. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about making the work and why you chose to start the exhibition with this work, because you can feel what you're talking about in interpreting Anna, the material differences in the process of telling that story and thinking through it.
Yeah. Um, One of the reasons that I liked reading Anzaldúa, and I think it came up pretty early in talking about the exhibition with Melinda, is just she's kind of unraveling the process for us. She's opening it up to all of the things that happen during the writing process and how messy it can get. And when she talks about it, she's not just talking about it in terms of like, oh, today I had creative block. But she's like quite specifically naming why the creative block is happening. Anything from physical pain to like a precarious economic situation or, uh, you know, waking up and not feeling it and all these things. And she's kind of trying to say, okay, but then these are the moments that I overcome that and I am able to sit down and write. These are the moments that it doesn't work. And it's this kind of constant movement of feeling uh, like both an attraction and to sit in front of our work and to be repelled by our work or kind of pushed away from it and trying to gather something. And I think that that sometimes happens when we are in relationship to others. And when I say that probably a relationship to my backstrap loom, a relationship to Anna, a relationship to some of the other kids that I've worked with. Sometimes it's like you want to see them and sometimes you don't, and it gets very confusing. I think the most confusing part for me is when the stories become an enmeshment and being really careful to not fall into that enmeshment with the the kind of trauma that I'm hearing will often kind of take me back into my own story and my own history in relationship to Guatemala. My family has gone through several violences there. It's one of the reasons I migrated to the States. I lost a brother, and so that kind of hits. And then it can also be reawakened by somebody else's story. And to try to parse out and be very specific and following through that heat that I was talking about and kind of combing things out and saying, okay, but this is me and this is the other. This is me, this is the other, and how tangled and confusing that can get. Or this is me and this is the backstrap loom. There's a tiny rephrase that I often think when working in the backstrap loom. It's a poem shared by a friend, and right now I'm gonna forget the author, so I apologize for that. But it's between Nilo and Nulo, there is only one letter. So Nilo means nest, and Nulo means not. And so between home and becoming confused, there's one small step. I don't know. That's how I kind of think of it. And like I often have to think, I'm not the knot. I'm not the thing that's tangled here. It's okay. Like I can weave it, I can straighten it, I can go through this process. So you'll see the motif of the E popping through and that weaving and kind of bulging out of it would be the raffia that then becomes tangled.
Thank you for that. It goes back to what we were saying in preparation for today about vantage points and thinking about um, always having an eye from outside yourself, on the weaving as it comes to be, which is a fascinating part of the process. I want to get to some of the works that are on the green walls in the space. And these are works that you made in collaboration with students at the Charles H. Hickey Detention Center. Starting with this one. So this work is made of all of raffia. I'm sorry, this title is not correct. This is called Hidden Pedagogies from 2025. Can you talk a little bit about how, I'm curious both how these works are made in conversation with the students, but then there's a memory that's sort of coming together in real time in the process of them being made. And as you were saying with interpreting Anna, there's also this lack of resolution to them because they're not fixed after they're finished. They're kind of always sort of evolving as your relationship evolves. And I'm curious to hear about how you think of them, whether they become then souvenirs of a particular moment in time, being in conversation with someone, or whether they become things that you can continuously revisit in the studio.
Yeah, I'd say definitely the second. I think I am always revisiting these things. And in this piece, I'll mention another kind of several other hands that took place, which were some of my students. I teach weaving and introduction to fibers at MICA. And so pedagogy is a really important part of my practice. And in the left image, or the kind of the raffia piece, for a long time, I would bring in small pieces of raffia and paper into these detention centers when I enter there for 12 or 14-hour shifts. I'm not allowed to bring anything really, sometimes a book and sometimes some paper or so on. And so I put this raffia in my shoe so that I can sit with some of the kids as they approach me and we can have something to do with our hands. But this way of making kind of is, yeah, it felt like souvenirs, like here I am bringing this piece of paper in and then kind of collecting it and taking it out. Sometimes I'd also trade with some of the kids. They do make like these friendship bracelets, and so I have a box kind of full of those, which are an unresolved material. But all to say is these little entanglements. I wanted to accumulate enough to make a piece, and I wasn't able to really do that. And so I took it to my students at MICA and taught them, and they kind of really excitedly just all put in all of their effort and just kind of brought all of these small, more souvenir-like things together and pieced it together. And I thought, wow, this is just an amazing way of understanding pedagogy, not as a thing that I'm telling somebody or a right or wrong answer, but rather something that's happening and growing together in a space. And I titled it Hidden Pedagogies because how often, not just the hidden aspect of me walking into Charles Hickey with this hidden in my shoe, but how acts of learning are not often taking place in this like very obvious way, but rather it's just kind of by handing over a material and a process or prompt to engagement to other people and how they bring it together. So I would definitely say that those are in process always. And they're kind of fun to see in my practice because I also think it breaks my sense of aesthetics. It reminds me that weaving isn't just this like, as much as I try to stay away from it, it isn't this like finalized object, but rather it's this act of constantly coming back to the loom and sitting with it. And I don't know, should I also talk about the image on the right? as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, because I think that's a great segue from what you just said about weaving being this expansive word relative to your practice. You've always worked in a really multidisciplinary way and with photography, with video, with collage, with all different kinds of methodologies. And so, yeah, tell us about Border Crosser, which is the work on the grid to the right too.
Yeah, so Border Crosser was another relationship that I've established through this work in interpretation. It is with a young um, kid who was at one of the detention centers. Um, and when we were working together, I don't know, you sometimes just form a nice bond with someone that they're very excited to see you, and you're very excited to see them. And what a strange thing to go find that in a youth detention center. Like it's not what I go expecting to find. And we quickly kind of realized that we enjoy just sitting and drawing together. And so he would tell me his stories and draw different things as he was talking, or between kind of school activities and I don't know, doing math or all of these other things. And so at one point, he had drawn this truck to explain to me how he crossed the border. And so um, you can see at the bottom, it's a self portrait. And so he was telling me how he crossed the border in this fruit truck hidden underneath all of the fruit. I saved this drawing, and then when he came out of the detention center, his aunt had called me to see if I could continue meeting with him and kind of drawing and, kind of having a relationship with him as an adult. And so I asked him when this show, and we were talking about the show, if he wanted to make a piece with me and that I had saved this drawing. And he kind of immediately said yes, that he wanted to make it really big. So one of the things that we did for this is he was also starting to kind of fall again into trouble. I went and visited him. And I found a used bookstore. So one of the things I asked him to do is that when his anxiety was starting to rise, that instead of kind of going and searching for things to ease his anxiety that would kind of put him in a precarious situation again, to go to the bookstore and search for the fruits and vegetables to make this piece. And so, yeah, we kind of accumulated this all and cut it out, and I projected it onto a wall and kind of recreated that same drawing, but enlarged. During this time, my dad was traveling back from Guatemala, or coming to visit me from Guatemala, and so I asked him to bring me all of these little fruits to kind of finish up the textile. So they're ceramic fruits that are often kind of bought in tourist markets and so on as kind of knickknacks for yeah when people travel. So yeah, that it kind of was an interesting process that brought together all sorts of elements that I maybe wouldn't have thought to use on my own. But it was a way for him to also immerse himself into this process of transformation through art, and to think about some kind of bigger questions on um, border crossing. And I don't know if this is why you brought this image up, but then I also started looking at how fruit comes into markets, that they are very well protected now. Like it's almost like you find each pear wrapped within its own little textile weaving. And so I've been collecting those and just thinking about the care that goes into having a fruit cross the border. But then here is Diaz, who is riding underneath the fruit truck and coming over in such a precarious way. Um, yeah.
Yeah, so I did pull these up for that reason because when you're in the space, you're both encountering this work at the same time that you're viewing the netting and the colorful sort of protective um, materials and fabrics that cover fruit that you've collected and put into these vitrines. And you've also included drawings and various, aspects. And are these from your time at the detention center as well, or were these an archive that you had already?
Uh, Both and. I think because when I go into the detention center, one of the things that has happened as a result is I've gone back into my drawing practice, which I had abandoned for some time because I was, just doing more sculptural things or weaving, but because the material I can take in there is so limited, that I often just take a couple markers and I sit there and fill out a grid. Sometimes they become conversation starters. Um, One of the things that this form of drawing references is another act of translation, which are, we call them marker drawings. When a lot of like these cross stitch diagrams come to Guatemala at, I don't know, it's the same type of pattern that you can buy when you go to a store to follow a cross stitch pattern, right? You get a piece of paper and all of these little colors are drawn into a grid and then you stitch them. Well, this kind of language made its way into a community called San Antonio, Aguascalientes. And it's just fascinating to see how in textiles, a weaver took this image and instead of going into cross stitching, which is an accessible form of stitching, they devised a whole new technique of weaving to put the cross stitch patterns into their weaving, and it's called a marker technique. So here's another instance of translation and interpretation and mistranslation, or like reusing language in a different way. And I just have collected these little drawings for some time. Sometimes I remake them. Sometimes I take the actual textile. I have worked with a weaver from that community named Doña Dinora, and she's gifted me a couple textiles. And sometimes in my lack of ability to recreate the marker technique, which she has taught me some, but I'm by no means good at it, I have been like, oh, okay, how do I start immersing myself in this language? And so I will take some of her weavings and also fill out these little grids and start to understanding kind of reverse translating them and trying to think how I can, or if, how I can, or even if I can enter into this language, am I ready for it before I kind of start weaving it? So these textiles here were a gift from Doña Dinora. The two ones that are kind of forming that X formation, the other two were collected from just a market, so I don't know who would have initially made them, but they are also in this E pattern. So here you see the X and the E again, but through the lens of Doña Dinora's garden, which is where she has taught me how to weave the marker technique.
How does the fold operate in the work?
Oh, I love. I think it's a way of reading textiles. Like it's so dynamic. I think that in pages you have this way, or in books you have this linear way of understanding things that you're going from one page to another, and certainly you can like do things to interrupt that, right? Like you can open up a random page in a book or so on, but then folds, they're kind of happening very naturally. It's almost like they're telling you how to read them. And by storing them, I'm a pretty tidy person. So whenever I store things, I end up finding new variations of how things come together through their folds. And I often think of these squares that are kind of holding those folds, and then my piece there at the end, which is an interpretation of the square format. So these square format textiles are called sutes, which are bundling fabrics. And a tanate is a bundle. And that's what you use to carry things. Anything from flowers to plates to carrying kids to carrying ceremonial um, objects or candles or so on. And I think about how the act of folding and refolding them um, is an act of reading and writing and storytelling. And so that back piece came from different iterations of playing with the folds and playing with how panels fold together. So you can see an X in the back, but then on the bottom, I interrupted that X. And we decided alongside with Melinda that it would be great to kind of show a landscape. And so, yeah, we just played with the form a little bit, and it kind of gives an entrance into this textile, which I think a lot about that essay of Ursula Le Guin's, like the carrier bag of fiction, right? Like that's one of the first things of storytelling is where like is the bag, not the book.
The landscape really recurs in the show as a theme. And it's something, that starts with thinking about encuentro and the encounter and you wrapped in fabric, sort of rolling along the frame of the video in Guatemala. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about this work before we move to the world upside down and inside out to close. Just about communicating those ideas in multiple formats and also the role of color in telling the story because your colors vary so much across the various works in the show. And so how are you making those decisions as you're considering the story that you're telling?
As far as the color goes, I swear I sometimes start with the color palette and then immediately break it. I'm like, oh, this is too limited. Like in my ideal world, I think with everyone, you'd be like, oh, okay, this is a consistent, voice that I'm gonna have, and then immediately it like goes out the window. But it's a start. This piece, to be honest, it's a hard one to talk about, and again, these are conversations which are so important and so wonderful to have when you have like a curator kind of sustaining a longer conversation with you, because I had brought up some works referencing my brother's death with Melinda, and I think sometimes I worry that I am stretching at the same pain, that I don't want to present um, the fact, that he was killed and this like really painful event is, I don't want to be an artist that's like going back to that pain to mine it in a way that is holding other parts still. Like grief is this funny thing that moves and it goes through many variations, and that includes humor and that includes sadness. Sometimes that includes thinking of him with happiness, sometimes anger, all of these things. And so we discussed if including a piece about my brother would be that act of like picking. And it was really nice to hear this clarifying voice of saying that it isn't that kind of picking, but it's rather an important part of my own story, kind of embedded within a larger story of migration. So yeah, we included this piece. You'll see two different images. On the left is actually a photo I took of my brother's grave when he was recently buried. And so on one side, the green is much brighter. On the other is the more yellower grass, because the grass was still kind of covering his grave. And obviously that's intensified by the panel, the kind of wool panels behind it. And then the other is an image that I found like during a hike. It was a tree that's top kind of had popped up, like probably a storm popped it off. And so it's almost as if the roots and the tops were confused. And I think often of the sense of the double tree, or a tree not being able to root itself, or kind of opposite directions. Um, and yeah, I'll kind of admit to it being like a little cheeky of like saying underground and upside down is like thinking of my brother being underground. I've been asked a bit about what I think um, about where he is, and it's like, oh, no, he's dead. That's kind of it. There's a flatness to it that I accept in my life. He's nowhere. That's the point. That's what death does. It takes it away. And so kind of thinking of his location in relationship to my location, and almost a flatness towards that or an acceptance. I go through some kind of not so funny moments of thinking about um, where he's currently located. So that's that piece.
How does transparency and opaqueness, play into thinking in this work? I think about these textile choices, which are very distinct in the context of the show, and also the photographs. Is that is the I think the choice of the transparent photograph and the way that the textiles sort of create um, this changing ground behind them is really fascinating in place. And thank you for sharing that story with us, Hellen. Yeah.
Um, the first piece I did after my brother died was titled What Remains, and it was done with scrap pieces of fabric. I think because what we were left with was kind of this scrap left, like this poor substitution of his life. Um, and so I gathered up a whole bunch. It was one of the first bundles I made. So thinking about the bundle from the opposite wall. And I just grabbed all the scraps, sewed them together kind of more like a quilt, then weaving and bundled up some flowers as a last embrace. Like the flowers were about the size of his body. And so every time I've gone back into this kind of work, I use fabric scraps. And it just happens to be that the work I did before this exhibition at the Sharjah Biennial, I was using wool, which is not a thing I often weave with. But I had purchased some kind of just wool to back the fabric and so on. And I had leftover pieces. And then the transparencies, I don't know, that's a good question. I mean, I do play a lot with reversals. Getting transparency is hard onto the type of weaving I do, and drawing on the weaving is hard. And so I don't always know that it's fully resolved, but it's a way I have resolved it is by printing out these printing on acetate, just because it's so clear, and then trying to just very brutally put one on top of the other and see if that works. I know it's something I need to think a little bit more about, but that's where it is now.
No, that was beautiful, Hellen. Thanks for sharing that with us. I want to end with this work, The World Upside Down and Inside Out. It takes its name from written work by Silvia Rivera Cusanqui. Can you talk a bit about titling the work, but also how you found this shape of the mobile strip?
I was reading Silvia Rivera Cusanqui's work actually in one of the detention centers, and it's interesting how an author will pass in front of you many times before you pay attention. And we spoke a little bit with Chloe about this vantage point that interpretation can give or translation gives, because I'm kind of always so immersed in, as we all are, in our own experience of moving through the world, that it's hard to realize what a duality I have in my brain from, or in my own experience between being a Guatemalan who now lives in the US. And often I'm kind of called as being bicultural as well as bilingual. But it doesn't feel that way to me. I very much feel Guatemalan. It just happens to be that I'm very good at stepping into the room of English. and then going back into Spanish. And, and there's always this tension of having two worlds exist inside you at the same time, and how they show up. And so I have referenced this double tree, both because I found it like in the image that we just saw. I've also seen it displayed in many textiles as the symbol. And it's interesting because it's always connected by an X in the middle. And given my research on X, then it's okay, then I can step into that symbolism because I too have experienced it, which is not something I often do, step into symbols. But I took it through that experience that I had. And then in resolving this piece, I think we were struggling a little bit with that corner. We were thinking about weaving three pieces coming together. I had done a piece like that before. And then it made sense to go back to this form of the Mobius strip that I take from Lucia Clark. So you can see I quite love Brazilian women artists. And when I wove it, I kind of had to weave it in reverse and in front and reverse. So it's a reversible technique called rep weave. But then when you stitch it together, that reversal becomes less clear in the weaving. So yeah, it was a way of taking what Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui said about having that tension exist inside you as you're stepping into different worlds, seeing it in the detention center, or seeing myself in some of the grappling that the kids are going through, both in language and culturally, which is different than in matching, but like seeing, oh, I do see that in myself. And then using this symbol as a way to talk about that sense of things being upside down and unrooted. And then because of the Mobius strip, also kind of flipped inside out.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Helen. This has been such a treat for me, and it's been so lovely to hear you talk about making each of these works. So thank you so much. We have several questions from the audience. So I'm going to pass the microphone over to Magli to ask some questions.
Thank you so much, Helen and Chloe. This was such a wonderful conversation. There were a few comments from the audience, so I'll start with those before getting to the questions. The first one is from Ruth Owens, and Ruth says, "Congratulations, my friend." Michelle says, more of a comment suggestion. The work of Karen Reimer and also Diana Frid would be well worth looking at. Diana came to Canada from Mexico and is most recently dealing more directly with her origins. She also works with textiles, embroidery, particularly in language. Congratulations on the work, especially to be in community with these students. Marvelous. Both of the artists mentioned are based in Chicago.
Thank you.
And then we have a question from GE. GE says, you've mentioned that there's a deeply embedded sense of poetry to the weaving. Have you also found that there's a sense of deeply embedded music in the making, and there a form of resistance within it?
Yeah. I don't know so much music. I have played a little bit with sound. I had a work titled How's Your Heart? And I also have recorded my backstrap loom and had a friend who is a musician kind of mix it in along with other gathered sounds. Music, I'm very tone deaf. So I always have to rely on somebody else to get to that musicality. But it was this friend who told me that that's okay to be tone deaf, and that actually just the act of reading out loud, that when I do that, I am putting out a sense of rhythm, and to trust that. So yeah, it's something that is always there. I thank you for picking that up, or bringing that kind of to the forefront, because it's a great Yeah, I mean, poetry comes from a sense of oral history and sitting around and reading our stories. It's not, um, yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that question, GE, and for that answer, Helen. We have a question from an anonymous audience member who wants to know what a day in the studio looks like, or a day making work. What does that look like?
That's a great question. I balance um, three different jobs. So sometimes a little chaotic. So I have my studio practice where we're sitting right now. Um, I teach or I adjunct at MICA. So sometimes my teaching load is lighter, sometimes it's heavier. And I also have these long interpretation shifts or assignments. So I would say that ideally, in the best um, scenario possible, I think about uh, writing, walking, and weaving. If I do that in a week, then it's a wonderful week. And sometimes those are happening in really stolen moments. So sometimes it means that I'm doing a little writing before the kids come out of their rooms in the morning, or I'm weaving. I've had to like really expand that idea and be like, okay, if my hands are on thread, it's weaving. So it means like undoing a skein. And then walking, I have two dogs. So that's an important part of my life and my practice and kind of to keep sane. But then if I am kind of in a more production focused mode, then it is being in the studio really early. I'm an early morning person and I love imagining all the weavers who are weaving alongside me. So actually, then it's very much quiet time. No music, no podcast, no sound. It's just me and the loom. And it happens very, very early in the morning. So I can be in the studio or weaving at like 5 a.m., 6 a.m. That's a gorgeous day. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. The last
Mhm.
question is from another anonymous audience member, and they're asking how your current teaching practice is impacted by previous collaborations with the children that you've worked with.
Oh, a lot. I say a lot, and then I immediately I kind of I don't know how to articulate it. It's such an extreme to go from like this week, Monday I taught weaving, and then Tuesday, Wednesday I was in detention centers, and so going from those extremes can be tiresome. But I also feel like I quite often put myself at those extremes. Like I used to teach young kiddos with um, autism, and then at night go and teach university. And so there's something about I'm finding a pattern in kind of capping my week with these extremes is a form for me. It's a way for me to realize that my reality, which of course I love being at a university and going to campus with a coffee and like, getting to sit and wax and wane on these wonderful ideas, but it also can pull me away from a reality of um that so many yeah that it's not a reality for a lot of people, and I don't want to detach myself from that. And so it's really important for me to have those two sides, um and everywhere in between. And I also think how a lot of times I walk into a class thinking that I have to say a lot and teach a lot. Like I I'm overly chatty sometimes, but then when I'm in the detention centers, it's just a lot about just sitting there and being present and just showing up. And so I'm trying to kind of just leave more moments of just sitting and letting things happen in the classroom instead of like over preparing and being overly chatty and here's all these readings and things and blah, blah, blah. No, we're just gonna, sit and weave today. That's it. That's the agenda. Um, yeah. So
Thank you so much for such a thoughtful answer. That wraps up the audience Q&A. I know that you wanted to close out with something that you put together for us.
This is a really nice prompt. Chloe was asking me if I could put together some readings, and she gave me that liberty of just, it didn't have to be a full reading, but just rather a collection of quotes that may come together. So I'll read. Catastrophe. Long before the word was used in a way we think of it today, catastrophe was a term used in ancient Greek drama to describe a reversal of what is expected, a turn of events. Kata meaning downward, and strophe meaning a turning. And this is from an essay by Eli Gah titled Bird Flight, Stone Flight, 1,000 Described Routes. I will set aside discussions focused on what writing is in order to concentrate on what writing does, what it enables us to do in our engagements with the world. Likewise, in relation to textiles, I will move away from approaches that interpret textiles as text or as stylistic evidence of ethno-historical traits, and instead focus on what textiles do and what they enable for their makers. This is from an essay by Denise Admon. That evening, I discovered that words like trees had roots whose magic my father has revealed to me. Translation became a tool of that apprenticeship. Translation, like practicing scales, learning to listen, that never-ending fine-tuning of nuance. Translation became the clay from which I would fashion my own interior language. From Genzel, translation is transhuman. Movement. Now, in the performing arts, as in any craft, novices have to learn through repetitive practice and copying models shown to them. To copy, however, is not to replicate a pre-existing form, but to align the observation of the model with action in a world suspended in movement. Fluent performance has a rhythmic quality, but this quality does not lie in the repetitiveness of movement itself. For there to be rhythm, movement must be felt. The practitioner who has a feel for what he or she is doing is one who can bring many concurrent movements more or less into phase with one another. This calls for continual correction in response to an ongoing perceptual monitoring of a task as it unfolds. And this is an essay by Tim Ingold, Learning, Folding, Following, Making. And then the last one from Kate Briggs in a book titled This Little Art. Translation conceived as a means of writing the other's work out with your own hands, in your own setting, your own time, and in your own language, with all the attention, thinking and searching, the testing and invention that the task requires. Translation as a laborious way of making the work present to yourself, of finding it again yourself for yourself. Translation as a responsive and appropriative practicing of a work at the level of the sentence, working it out. A workout on the basis of the desired work whose energy source is the inclusion of the new and different vitality that comes with and from me.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was beautiful.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It was so nice to see you all.
Thank you, Helen. That was such a nice way to close us out. And thank you, Chloe, for your great facilitation. We'd also like to thank Melinda and Maria from the ISCP for their support and preparing for today's event. I'd like to thank the TERRA Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free, join us Monday at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Enrique Martinez Celaya and Jessica Holmes on the occasion of the wilderness at Gallery Wendy Norris. And as Israel tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
everybody.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Helen.
Great conversation.